Hello there, AP Human Geography students. Let's keep learning about urbanization around the world. Today we're going to talk about a lot of city models and city zoning. So let's do it. All right, so there's some city models that you absolutely have to know. And if we're doing this in person, I have this really great handout that has all of these models that are really detailed. And usually I just have kids, I give them some glue and some scissors, and you cut out these handouts and you actually glue them right into your notes. If that's not possible, you might have to copy these models with a pen or a pencil. But maybe if you're doing it online, you can just screen grab them and throw them in your notes somehow. But the model types you absolutely have to know are what certain cities tend to look like if you looked at them from a top-down view. Specifically, the Islamic city, the African city, the Latin American city, and the Southeast Asian city. And I'm going to zoom in on all of these respectively. And all of these models assume something called an isometric plane. And this is true with like the von Thunen model in the agriculture unit as well. It assumes that like the whole city is just on this flat, easy to move around space. Because in reality, there's going to be mountains, rivers, lakes, and valleys. So those will kind of make these models not as applicable or not as perfect, but for the most part, these models actually do apply to most cities in these respective regions. And so I'm going to talk about what these models look like and why they look like the way they do in these various parts of the world. Okay, so let's check them out. All right. I don't think you have to copy down these parts into your notes. You just got to get the models for sure. Okay, so this is what an African city tends to look like. It'll have a core in the middle, which will be surrounded by a high residential zone, then surrounded by kind of the elite residential zone, which will be maybe a little more spread out, a little better houses. And then behind the elite houses, there's kind of a circular zone of mixed intermediate houses. But then on the edges of African cities, there's a whole lot of shanty towns or villages. A great example city for this would be the city of Johannesburg in South Africa. And I've shared this with my sister, who's been to hundreds of African cities. And I mean, she'll say like, oh, this one city has a river running through it, so it doesn't really apply. Or this city has a big mountain, so the rich people are kind of spread out. But if you really analyze this model, it does apply to most African cities where the shanty towns are on the outskirts of the city. There's high density, big apartments near the middle of the city, and then kind of the rich people have their houses spread out in the middle between those two extremes. All right, next one. So a Latin American city, Mexico City is an excellent example of this. So is Brazil's capital, Brasilia. It's pretty similar to the African model, but with some differences. There's kind of this long boulevard, this sort of big shopping street that kind of goes out from the core of the city down. Mexico City has a really famous one of these, and I think I eventually show some pictures of it. But so there is kind of the original core of the city. There's the extended core, and based off the extended core, that's where you'll have usually most of the elite people living. They'll be living along kind of the main boulevard of the city. And then near the middle of the city, this is where there's kind of they call it the mature residential zone. This is where maybe the older buildings are. A lot of these Latin American cities tend to have kind of this new construction zone. Mexico City is an excellent example of this. But then surrounding the whole city, that's where you'll find squatter settlements where there's just, these are basically people living in shanties, living in shacks, or just really terrible building materials used to make their houses. So you'll always see that on the outskirts of most cities in the developing world, but especially in African cities and Latin American cities. All right, moving on. Okay, and then the Southeast Asian city. This is probably the most unique city model you'll see. And this model especially refers to how ports were set up in Southeast Asia. So you would especially see this in places like Bangkok, Singapore, Ho Chi Minh City, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, where these cities were sort of designed by Europeans 300 or so years ago, and they were designed to just be this place where European ships would stop over, they'd do a lot of trading, and then they'd leave. But as international trading has become more and more popular in the modern world, this city model has kind of we can actually kind of witness it happening in quite a few cities in Southeast Asia today. And there's this market gardening zone. I hope you remember that term from the agriculture unit, where there'll be some like a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables and stuff. And usually it's so that they can deal with the ships coming into the port, because sailors, they generally don't have a lot of fruit and vegetable options out there in the ocean. And then there'll be kind of these racially segregated commercial zones, kind of the European zone, the Chinese zone, the Indian zone. And it's cool because it's kind of this multicultural zone near the port, but it's so they could best trade various commodities that would be appropriate to those cultures. And then the mixed residential zone is close to the port, but as you move away from the port, that's where you'll find maybe the more elite zones, the new suburbs, and there will be some squatter settlements mixed in there as well. But then, the industrial estates always got to be as close to the port as they can. That's especially true in China today. All right, and then here's the Islamic city model. There's only a couple things I got to point out with this one. There's always going to be a big mosque in the middle of most cities in the Islamic world. Mosques are kind of the place of prayer and the huge cultural center for the Islamic world. So find them in the center of the city. Makes sense. And then surrounding the mosque, that is the bazaar, which is kind of a fancy way of saying the outdoor shopping center. And there's a whole lot of bazaars in the Middle Eastern world, and it's still kind of the traditional way people do their shopping. And then there's city walls, forts, and cemeteries, but those aren't as relevant in the modern world today. A lot of those have been torn down or taken apart so it can have a better flow of human interaction. All right. And I don't think you'll take a lot of notes on this. You'll just see more examples of these city models that I just showed. So city models. So here's just another fancy way of showing the Latin American model. I don't think you have to get all this fancy stuff on it, but it calls it the dissemnity zone out here. And that's actually a more applicable human geography term. But it means like this is the zone of town where the government just doesn't care about people. And it's sad but true that in so many parts of the Latin American world, there's people living in pretty terrible squatter settlements. The zone of perpetual squatter settlements. Oh gosh, that's hard. Gentrification, this is a topic I talk about in a future video. The zone of maturity, this is saying that this is the old part of the city, but maybe it's doing pretty well. But there is kind of this elite center of the city near this mall around this big boulevard street. And that's where almost all the action happens. And then CBD, the Central Business District. I'm sure I'll talk about this later in this presentation. Buenos Aires, Argentina. Look at that big, giant street in the middle of the city. Look at all these fancy buildings all around it. But then if you look on the other side of this fancy street, you're going to see a whole lot of pretty terrible living conditions. And that's the reality with many major Latin American cities. And Brasilia, look at this giant street in the middle of Brasilia. Wow. So this huge street, this is where kind of everything is built off of. And then when you get further away from that big street, people are kind of living in poverty. All right. And then, Western European city model. I don't know if I really hit on this one well, but I'll mention it. You don't have to copy this model into your notes. But the Western European city model tends to just sort of be based around a big cathedral in the middle of the city. It's kind of the traditional European cities. And then most people actually just still, even to this day, walk everywhere. Or they use public transportation to get around, maybe like a subway system. So that's really what these cities are based on. But it's, I'll just skip this one for now. All right, but the Amsterdam, you see just how compact the city of Amsterdam is. And I've been to Amsterdam, had a great time there, and the whole city is designed where people just walk around places. In fact, Amsterdam is very not car-friendly, and that's a huge part about the European city model. They were just designed, 1,000 years ago. Amsterdam city center. The only places you could drive cars are these yellow streets. So even if you did live in the middle of this part, you can't physically get there. But Amsterdam is a city built with waterways in mind. So people have their own little boats and they can go up and down these canals. That's pretty great. And here's Amsterdam from the sky. You see all the canals, how it's in this really intricate grid pattern. So it was definitely designed real well for a time before cars, that's for sure. All right, and London, London's roads are just a mess. Like, just look at London right here. How the heck does some of these roads even make sense? Honestly, like, they shouldn't have even tried to put car roads in London. They should have been like, okay, you've got the subway system, you can walk places, do that. Because I've been in a car in London and it's so slow, it's so painful, I don't recommend it. Okay, and then Eastern European cities. Okay, don't copy this one in your notes either. But this one is largely based on how the Soviet Union designed a lot of cities, is my understanding. And I don't want to deep dive into this because it's not even in the human geo-articulation anymore. Okay. Yeah, Tallinn, Estonia. You just see, once again, these cities weren't designed with cars in mind. The city streets are just a mess. Just a mess. Yeah, Tallinn's Old Town. So the city's built in these weird angles, and this is probably one of the original centers of the city. It had a natural wall built around it. Tallinn's Economic Center. Ooh, that looks kind of cool. Is that a mosque? I think it is. And then, okay, Africa cities. This is definitely something I got to talk a little bit more about. This is really the same map I showed you earlier in this presentation, so I don't think I have to highlight anything new here. But Freetown, Liberia. Okay, so let's see how Freetown applies. Is there a central district of the town where a lot of fancy people live near it, and then are there shanties on the edge? Well, let's look. It seems like this part of town is definitely the most well-organized, the most well-designed. So I think this part of town is where you'll see a whole lot of fancy things happening, but then as you get further away from the town, you're going to find these roads that aren't even fit for cars to drive on, and this is probably where a lot of the shanty settlements are as you get further and further away from the central part of Freetown. Okay, and then Johannesburg, South Africa. Here's the city center. So near the city center, this is where the town's going to look pretty good, but as you get further and further away, probably Kempton Park, Tembasa, 4-Way, 8, this is where the city isn't going to look so good, and a whole lot of people are going to be living in shanties. And Soweto, this is a really famous shanty town near the city of Johannesburg, and it's pretty far away from the city center, so it totally makes sense and fits the model. All right, so yep, Joburg. This is what people call Johannesburg. If you're actually from there, that's what Soweto looks like. This is what the center of the city looks like. It's not a very equitable distribution of wealth or resources. So that's something to note. All right, and then, yeah, the Southeast Asian city. This is something you absolutely have to know. And what does it got here? So, yeah, it's really all the same stuff that I highlighted earlier. So let's see some examples. And this is the city of Bangkok. So Bangkok is one of these port cities. So let's see. Does it have a China commercial core? Does it have a Western commercial core? Does it have an Indian commercial core? Well, here is Chinatown. So they got the China part. Do they have an India part? I don't think it's easily identified on this map. But I'll tell you, I've been to Bangkok, and I've been to Khao San Road. And Khao San Road, I don't even know if it's on this map, but Khao San Road is definitely the kind of western part of town. And you can see they've got some garden zones, which I think are all kind of public gardens today, but I'm sure back in the day those were the market gardening used to kind of service the port. All right, and yep, Bangkok today. Bangkok is also, they've got shanties and they've got really, really fancy buildings. So it's living in both worlds if you're going to Bangkok. All right. So, and then here's just sort of a bigger question for human geo. Why do cities look the way they do? Why are some cities all about apartments? Why are some cities all about houses that all look the same, that are spread out over a long distance? You got to consider a whole lot of aspects. Consider geography, economy, culture. Every part of the world is going to have different priorities they put in their cities. So let's check these out. Like Orange County, California, very different from living in Hong Kong. Living in this shanty in Jakarta, very, very different from living in this Shanghai city center in China. So different things to consider with different cities, for sure. Okay. And then you should have already written about Megalopolis from your homework. Yeah, I talked about Megalopolis a little bit in the last time. But let's see examples of megalopolises around the world. And I think, well, maybe I haven't officially defined it in the Prezi yet, but a megalopolis is a big city. Real big. Like visible from outer space. You know, it's a city that is frequently talked about in international movies. Okay, that's a megapolis. So here's all examples of what you could consider megapolis. Like, look at these are street signs in Cairo, Egypt, all written in Arabic, trying to advertise the various services these buildings offer. So they're kind of all on top of each other, which is pretty crazy to me. And yeah, here's just some housing. I think this is in Seoul, South Korea. And then here's just Tokyo, and it's so much detail they couldn't even get all the pixels in the image. Okay, characteristics of a megapolis. Huge population density, covering hundreds of square miles. These are just mega cities visible from space. And it usually wasn't just one city from the get-go. It was sort of like one city kept growing and growing, and its urban area consumed other cities, and it kept growing and growing. You'll find transportation links between a megapolis. It'll be pretty common for you to get in a train in Narita and end up in Yokohama and kind of travel consistently without sort of seeing a break in the urban zone. Very high portion of the nation's wealth, commerce, and political power. And what's happening more and more in our world is each country tends to sort of have one megapolis where kind of all the country's major decisions and major business, usually even major political choices, are all made. So that's just what tends to happen more and more, that these super cities dominate a country's entire economic landscape. Okay, but what are some problems of megapolises? Why are they maybe a bad idea? Well, I'm going to argue, though, that megapolises are sort of a good idea, because if all the humans live in one space, then you can kind of save all the rest of your country for nature and animals and not have humans mess with it. But alternatively, whenever you have people, you're going to have congestion and overcrowding. Land prices are going to be really high. It's definitely cheaper for people to spread out. There'll be a lot of water and air pollution in most megapolises. And then this is a big problem too. If the megapolis becomes so big and so important, the rural people in the smaller cities of your country are going to feel like they're not getting a good deal. They'll feel neglected, and that could cause some political problems. And we'll see some modern examples of that in the next unit of Human Geo. And these problems are difficult to solve because sometimes these megapolises not only cross regional borders within your country, some megapolises flow into other countries as well. So you have to consider that, you know, this megapolis is on two sides of the same border, or on different borders. Okay, so the biggest megapolis in the world is this one. It's Tokyo. And I've been to Tokyo, kids, and the crazy thing is downtown Tokyo is way over here, but Tokyo International Airport is located 4 hours away by bullet train. Like, it's crazy that Tokyo's airport is like 6 hours away by driving. It's sort of like I'm flying into Los Angeles, but I'm gonna, fly my plane into Phoenix, Arizona. And you're probably wondering, Mr. Brown, why did they build that airport so far away? Well, because the city was already so ridiculously big, and nobody wanted to bulldoze a bunch of buildings to make a big old giant airport. So yeah, and Tokyo's megapolis has consumed so many other cities in Japan. And I know that Japan today, it's sort of like two megapolises. It's like the Osaka megapolis and the Tokyo megapolis. To a degree, they've still got Nagoya and Fukuoka and Hiroshima, but I know that all three of those zones are kind of shrinking and falling. Already Osaka has consumed Kyoto and Kobe, so Japan may eventually just sort of be two big giant super cities. That tends to be the trend in Japan. Okay. And then here is the megapolis of the United States. Here they just call it megapolis. But it is one consistent urban zone here in the United States. It starts here in Washington, D.C., and if you get on the freeway and you just start driving northeast, you'll eventually hit the city of Baltimore. You keep driving northeast, you hit the city of Pennsylvania. Keep driving northeast, you hit New York and Trenton, New Jersey. Keep driving Hartford, Connecticut. Keep driving, and maybe there's a little gap here, but then you hit Boston. And so this is just the super industrial region of the United States, and it's more or less one super consistent mega city. So that's what this is about. All right. And then the megapolitan areas of the United States. So, of course, the true Megalopolis is the one I just identified, but here are some other megapolitan areas. Isn't that cool? They gave Las Vegas a megapolitan note. I didn't even think that. But what I know nowadays is the Texas Triangle is way more filled in. Like, this is one super dense place of a lot of people living there today. Cascadia is a pretty dense spot. Basically, California is almost nonstop cities now. You could drive almost from San Francisco to Los Angeles going straight through cities without stopping. The Midwest is pretty megaopolis. So those are just these interconnected urban zones. Okay, and then, so where are the big cities in the world in 2014? So let me see if I can identify all of these. Let me put my geography skills to the test. So New York, LA, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Brasilia, Lagos, Kinshasa, London, Paris, Moscow, Istanbul, Cairo. Oh man, all the India cities are rough. Karachi, Mumbai, Delhi, Bombay, Dhaka. Ooh, I did it. Jakarta, Manila, Tokyo, Osaka, and then, shoot, I don't know all the cities in China, but I do know Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, and I don't know those other two. Dang it. I was so close to getting them all. But, yep, those are the biggest cities in the world in 2014, and if we advance forward to 2020, we would probably just see a whole lot more cities pop up in China, honestly. That would be the big way this map would change. But just huge cities in China. So what is a megapolis? Yep, it's a really, really big city, okay? And there's Tokyo Tower. So Tokyo is the example. All right. So let's explain the site and situation of all these following cities. All right, so here's Denver. So Denver's site is located right at the border between the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains. Why did it make sense to build a city there? Well, Denver was this big kind of stopover point for all the people going on the Oregon Trail, trying to get to the west coast of the United States. So it made sense to build this kind of final trading post right before the difficult journey of going over the mountains. And I was in Denver last year. I had a really great time visiting friends in Denver and Boulder. So pretty cool place. And so much of Colorado, actually, like all the major cities are kind of on this north-south axis right before the Rocky Mountains get really big. Okay, and then here's the city of Singapore. Its site is located at the very bottom tip of Asia. I think Singapore is technically the southernmost. Well, Singapore is an island, but if it were attached to Asia, it would be the southernmost tip of Asia. And it's in this great spot right here in the Malacca Strait. Every single ship that sails between China and India goes through the Malacca Strait. So Singapore can be like, what up? Stop over here. Refuel on your supplies. Pay us your money. So Singapore is just an ideal spot. All right, and then here's London. Why is London where it is? Well, if you'll notice, London is right along the Thames River, and the Thames goes right here into the North Sea. It's probably the biggest river in England, so makes sense to build this big giant city right along this great, easy to navigate river. All right, and here's Hong Kong. Why is Hong Kong a successful city where it is? It's right here on the border with the South China Sea, really close to, oh, what river is this? The Hangsu River? Oh, shoot. I don't remember the name of this river. But, yeah, right here at the southern border of China, really close to another bunch of bigger Chinese cities. So Hong Kong, really, really awesome spot. And then what I'm going to argue is the best location for a city on planet Earth is the city of Istanbul. Istanbul is one of these cities. This half is all the continent of Europe, and this half is the continent of Asia. And Istanbul is the only way you can get between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. So they've got the Bosphorus Strait right here, And if you want to travel between these two water masses, you got to stop over to Istanbul, pay them some money, refuel on supplies, all that. So Istanbul is the best spot for a city. I hold that argument high. All right, and then I think here I wanted to highlight Quebec City. So this is an excellent spot for a city as well because, look, you want to get into the Great Lakes, you want to sail a ship there, gotta get through Quebec. And after you get through Quebec, then you go right into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, connect to the Atlantic Ocean, trade all over the world. So really awesome spot for a city there too. Okay. All right, so city planning. This is kind of my last big part of this presentation today. City planners are responsible for determining how a city grows. And I think a really cool job would be a city planner, where you kind of design how land will be used, where parks will be, where schools will be, where residential business would be, where streets and roads will be, and you want to do it the most efficient way possible. And here in the United States, and well, with most countries in the world, every single piece of land in a city is determined to be through a zoned category. And in the United States, we have 4 kinds of zoning: public, residential, industrial, and commercial. And each one of these, more or less, are related to one of the sectors of the economy. And industrial center is either a primary source where you're like mining stuff, or it's a factory with a secondary source. Commercial is tertiary and quaternary, where you're either selling goods, selling services, or you are managing a company and designing goods or designing services. Residential, that's where people live, and that's what most cities tend to be nowadays. And public, that's for parks and nature. And I know that Southern Highlands here in Las Vegas, we've got a lot of really awesome public parks, and we got really good zoning for that. I'll tell you, in North Vegas, the zoning laws weren't planned out very well, and there's huge parts of North Vegas with like no parks at all, which is really sad. And also, in North Vegas, there are some industrial zones that are right next to residential zones, and that tends to not work out so well, okay? People don't want to be right next to a concrete mine and hear like drills going off all the time. So you've got to be a really smart person to design city zoning in a good fashion. All right, cool. Moving on. Oh yeah, and commercial always wants to be near infrastructure. There's no point in building a store if people can't get to it. So there you go. All right, let's check out some land zoning stuff. So here's a zoning map, and you see that these different colors are associated with the different zones. So that's all pretty cool, and I'm sure these white spots are streets. And what is this? The city of Ontario and how it's zoned. So what do they got? They got residential zoning, industrial zoning, commercial zoning. That's all kind of the vibe here. And so what zone would this be associated with? This would be commercial. This wouldn't be commercial. This would be industrial because they're making some pollution. They're probably making a lot of loud noises, chemicals. So this is absolutely industrial zoning. All right, this is industrial zoning again. This would be commercial zoning. These are some stores. This would be residential zoning, some apartments. And maybe you could even consider this little bit public zoning. And here's our houses. So this would be residential. This would be industrial as well because this is a factory. And this would be probably a mix, actually. I would imagine that, well, no, I don't know if this is a mix. But this is looking close to a mixed zone. But probably more commercial than anything else. Okay, and then this is a really cool vibe. This is a mixed zone of public park and housing. So cool. They do this kind of stuff in Italy nowadays. All right, and then this would be commercial. Okay, so I've got this little Sim City puzzle that I want you kids to solve. I won't explain it here on this slide. I'll introduce this to you live sometime in the future. But it's a kind of cool puzzle, and every year I only get a couple kids that figure out the correct solution. So hopefully if you're a puzzle-challenged kid, you can complete it as well. All right, and I'll save this for the next video. Peace out.